Chapter 4 of Tractate Chullin covers the laws of animal fetuses in regards to the laws of slaughter. The first Mishnah says, if an animal is slaughtered and a fetus was found inside, whether it's dead or alive, the fetus is kosher, as it's considered to have been slaughtered with the mother. If the animal had a difficult labor, and the fetus kept sticking its leg out and pulling it back in, and the animal was slaughtered, the fetus would still be kosher. If the fetus stuck its head out, however, even if it drew it back in, it's as if it was born and is a separate entity, meaning it would require its own slaughter. If somebody cut off part of a fetus inside an animal's womb and the mother is then slaughtered, the detached parts inside are still kosher. However, if somebody detaches part of the mother's actual spleen or kidney and then slaughters the animal, the detached parts are not kosher. The general rule is that if detached parts that are part of the actual animal are found inside, they're not kosher. But if they're not part of the actual animal's body, such as a fetus, they would be kosher. The Gemara says, whether the fetus's limb being stuck in and out of the animal, the fetus would be kosher, but the actual limb that was being stuck out wouldn't be. It debates the source for this. Another source seems to imply that that's not true, that the limb would still be kosher, but we dispute if that's referring to the actual limb as kosher, or to the rest of the fetus as permissible, which is what we stated here. Some derive that it would be permitted to eat the place of severance here, and also derive that an animal fetus of a cow that has joined hooves, which as mentioned in the prior chapter isn't kosher, an animal needs split hooves, but if such an animal was still a fetus and hasn't yet been born and it's still inside of the animal, it would still be kosher. Some disagree very simply and just state that the fetus's limb that went back and forth out of the animal would be kosher, basing it on the interpretation of a verse. It is, however, refuted. Some say the dispute is on if a limb is prohibited once it leaves its bounds. Others interpret the dispute as being if there's birth for individual limbs. The practical difference between the two is if majority of the limb leaves the womb. Only according to the latter version, the rest of the limb that's still inside would be prohibited. Now, according to the opinion that there's no birth for individual limbs, it asks, what if a fetus sticks out each of its limbs individually, so it's majority born, but only a little bit at a time? Or by the same principle, what if individual limbs are stuck out and each one is severed one after the other? It tries to prove either way, but that stands unresolved. Or it's asked, what if a fetus sticks a leg out while it's inside the temple courtyard? As the courtyard wall is considered a boundary for slaughtering offerings, perhaps it could also be a boundary for the birth of a fetus to make them permissible. That's rejected, as technically the walls of the city of Jerusalem are themselves a boundary for the consumption of certain offerings, and those wouldn't do anything here. If a fetus sticks out a leg during the actual act of slaughter, right between the severing of the trachea and the esophagus, it's said that as the two severings are combined for the animal, they'll also combine for the fetus. Okay, what if a fetus stuck out its limb before slaughter and was then later removed totally alive and it grew up and had its own child, as it's explained, with another unborn extracted fetus that grew up? It's asked if that child's corresponding limb would be problematic or not. Alternatively, some suggest the question to be where the extracted grown-up fetus has milk, if that milk is then kosher. This whole case stands unresolved. We said if a fetus has a part cut off inside the animal, the detached part is still kosher. That's sourced and discussed further. There are actually disputing opinions on where this is sourced from. New Mishnah. If an animal is struggling to deliver its first child, it would be permissible to cut out parts of the fetus as they emerge. And it's not considered to be a firstborn animal for the firstborn animal tithe, so it could still be benefited from by feeding it to dogs, for example. If the majority of the fetus emerged whole and was then cut apart, it must be buried, and the future children born by the mother animal are not firstborns. The Gemara says if a third of a firstborn fetus came out of an animal and was sold to a non-Jewish person, and then another third came out, it's a dispute if it's sanctified to the temple as a firstborn. Some say it is, as it's sanctified retroactively once majority emerges. Others disagree and say that the sale stands as valid. Similarly, if a fetus came out a third through the abdominal wall and a third through the womb, the same dispute exists as to if this is sanctified as a firstborn animal tithe. Both of these are mentioned, as by the first case, the retroactive sanctification creates a leniency, but here this principle would create a stringency. Others dispute the point from our Mishnah. They're discussed. If exactly half of a fetus emerges, but with majority of one limb, it's a debate if the rest of the limb has the same status as the majority. If the fetus was wrapped in plant fibers or garments, or it was in a different animal's amniotic sac, and the fetus emerged feet first, or if a weasel stuck its mouth into an animal's womb and swallowed and extracted a fetus and then spat it out back into the womb, or if an animal gave birth to a fetus into a different animal's womb and the fetus passed between wombs, all of those cases go unresolved. If the fetus was born without ever touching the walls of the birth canal, because they were stretched so wide, for example, it's asked Is it the airspace or the actual walls of the birth canal that sanctify an animal as a firstborn? So it would also be a question if the walls of the birth canal peel off and touch the fetus in an unusual manner, such as by coiling around its neck, or similar questions. It is, however, stated that if the walls of the birth canal are entirely stripped away, the fetus is definitely not sanctified as a firstborn. New Mishnah. If an animal's fetus died inside its womb and the shepherd came over and stuck his hand inside to touch it, the shepherd is still pure. Others say he's impure if the animal was impure. The Gemara explains the debate between sources for this conversation. A number of verses are expounded on, and these are discussed further. New Mishnah. If a human woman's fetus dies inside of her womb and the midwife touches it, the midwife is impure for 7 days for having touched the corpse, while the mother is only impure once the fetus comes out. The Gemara says, similarly, an impure object that's swallowed doesn't transmit impurity towards other objects, and a pure object that's swallowed doesn't acquire impurity from other objects. That's sourced. It also sources the fact that the same principle applies if the object wasn't swallowed, but was instead inserted into the body via the rectum. Further sources are quoted that this also applies to animals and similar. These principles that swallowed objects do not transmit or acquire impurity was actually stated elsewhere, so this isn't redundant, as it's actually telling us that if somebody, for instance, swallowed 2 rings, one that was pure and one that was impure, they don't contaminate impurity to each other. Anyways, our Mishnah seemingly contradicts this, as we said a fetus contaminates the midwife, but that's said to be different, as that's only a rabbinically instituted contamination of impurity, meaning this would apply even if somebody held that the dead fetus in the womb was pure. This was instituted so if the dead fetus's head pokes out of the birth canal, no one's going to touch it and then become impure. As for the woman giving birth, she'll be aware as to when the fetus is fully born. There's just concern she won't tell the midwife, as she'll be very preoccupied with giving birth. It argues further on the sources regarding certain verses. New Mishnah. If an animal had a difficult labor, and the fetus stuck out a leg, and it was severed, and the mother was then slaughtered, the remaining flesh of the fetus is pure. If the mother was slaughtered, and then the foreleg was slaughtered, it's impure by contacting an improperly slaughtered animal. Others disagree and say it's impure by contact with a slaughtered animal with a defect. These are 2 variations in laws of impurity. It explains this debate, and also sources the principle that slaughtering an animal with a defect thereby makes it pure. It is said that if an 8-month-old fetus is born alive, its slaughter does not purify it, as it has no variant that's fit for slaughter. The Gemara asks, why in the Mishnah's case should there be impurity, as it's in a concealed area? It suggested possibly that the limb gives impurity in the moment that it's severed, once it's detached, but it's still touching the rest of the body. Alternatively, it's that as it stands to be severed, it's as if it is. These are additionally discussed. It also says it's a rabbinic principle that an animal with a defect that is slaughtered, if it's consecrated to the temple, then it would transmit impurity. Further disputes between the listed opinions as to how this animal is rendered impure. Additionally, there's a debate regarding a limb dangling from an animal, as it's mostly detached as to why it's impure, and therefore if slaughter could purify it. The variation is as a dangling limb is still part of the animal's body, unlike by a protruding fetus limb, which is separate. Related, it said that an animal dying in a way other than slaughter affects legal detachment of the limbs, specifically by the dangling limbs of the animal. This is said to not apply by proper slaughter. It additionally clarifies these laws of impurity, and quotes for the sources for all of this. There was a dispute as to if a fetus's limb is protruding from an animal when it's slaughtered, if it maintains its impurity. This applies to a live fetus. By a dead fetus, it's a debate further if either they agree it's still impure or that it's still a dispute. It clarifies the exception by the 8-month-old fetus. New Mishnah. If somebody slaughters an animal and finds an 8-month-old fetus inside or a dead 9-month-old fetus, it's kosher without being slaughtered, although its blood must be removed first, as blood is forbidden to be eaten. If there was a live 9-month-old fetus inside, according to Rabbi Meir, it must be slaughtered to be eaten, and it cannot be slaughtered on the same day as its parent, which is a later discussed principle. While the sages say its mother's slaughter was sufficient to cover this. Some say even if the fetus then grows to be several years old and can plow a field, for example, its mother's slaughter still covers it, and it can be killed and eaten without proper slaughter. If somebody did not slaughter an animal and just opened it up and found a 9-month-old fetus inside, it must be slaughtered properly, as its mother wasn't. The Gemara clarifies, this leniency by animal fetuses only applies to slaughter. By other laws, like prohibitions against bestiality or plowing with it and other forbidden mixtures of animals, this would still be forbidden, just like by all other animals of all other ages. Some actually allow the forbidden fats of an animal fetus as kosher and would also allow the blood. Others say both of these are not allowed. It's discussed between these. Also, if a firstborn donkey fetus is fully developed, according to the opinion that the slaughter of its mother purifies it so it doesn't need slaughter anymore, it argues if it can then be redeemed for the firstborn tithe. There's also dispute regarding its contamination of types of impurity and similar. These are additionally discussed. For instance, if a fish developed invalidating defects, it's unresolved if that is susceptible to types of impurity. If an animal miscarried, the status of the fetus's fats regarding impurity is also a debate. There's also a dispute if somebody slaughters an animal with a defect and then finds a live 9-month-old fetus inside, as to whether that's kosher based on the status of its mother. This is additionally disputed, along with the remaining points. Some say the ending rule is that a fully developed live fetus is considered slaughtered, as are its offspring and their offspring forever. Others disagree with this. It's discussed further. New Mishnah. Some defects by the hind legs. If the hind legs are severed below the joint, they're still kosher. If they're severed above the joint, it's a defect and it's not kosher. If the junction of sinews was removed, it's not kosher. If the bone was fractured and the skin is pierced, if majority of the flesh remains, the slaughter purifies the limb to be eaten, otherwise it does not. The Gemara disputes which joint exactly we're discussing here. Some say it's the lower tarsus joint, others say it's the upper joint, the patella. It additionally disputes between these opinions based on the later cases of the sinews being severed. There is also a debate as to where this junction of sinews is. It's by the tarsus joint, but there are three opinions. One says it's just above the bone, others say it's across it, and one says it's just below it. It's also disputed as to exactly how far up this extends. It's said to go up 4 finger breadths by an ox, and by a sheep or a goat, it's where they protrude, and where they're hard and thick, and where they're white. Others say it's even where they're pale. Anyways, there are 3 of these sinew strands, a thick one and 2 thin ones. If the thick one is severed, that's a defect, as it's most of the structural majority, and it's not kosher. And if the 2 thin ones are severed, then that's a defect, as the numeric majority is lost. Others say it's the exact opposite. If just the thick one is cut, it's fine, as it still has the numeric majority, and if just the thin ones are cut, it's fine, as it still has the structural majority. By birds, it said there are 16 strands of sinew in the junction, and if any of them are severed, that's a defect. Some say it's enough by an animal for the greater part of the sinews to be severed to create an invalidating defect. Others say it needs to be the greater part of each of the sinews. It clarifies the location of the bone fracture, creating a defect, and related. It's said, we rule that if the animal has a compound fracture on its leg above the tarsus, and the greater part of the bone is not covering the flesh, it's an invalidating defect. It's added that the limb would also transmit impurity through carrying it, but others dispute this. This case is further defined, and it's also said that skin here is equivalent to flesh. These parameters are defined further, and it brings some additional specific cases of bone breakages and fractures. For instance, if skin is scraped away in a ring around the area of a fracture, it's said, as the flesh will regenerate if the bone takes hold of it, it's still valid. New Mishnah, if somebody slaughters an animal and finds an amniotic sac inside, if somebody wants to eat that and he doesn't find it gross, he's allowed to eat it. It normally does not contract impurities of several variants, but if somebody plans on eating it, it would contract impurity as a food. If an amniotic sac partially emerges, it cannot be eaten as it had a fetus. If an animal with its firstborn fetus miscarries an amniotic sac, it can be given to the dogs to be eaten without concern for the firstborn tithe. If this happened with an animal consecrated as an offering, the sac should be buried. This should not be done by a fork in the road, and it should not be hung in a tree, as that was something done for superstitious reasons by the ancient Amorites, which shouldn't be emulated. The Gemara brings sources for all this. If a donkey hide was cooked extensively, it disputes if it has impurity as a food, which is unresolved. If just the amniotic sac came partially out of the womb, if it actually has a fetus, it's a dispute if we can assume that that's the actual sac's fetus, and if it's then permitted. It's said that there would be variation here. The reason a miscarried firstborn amniotic sac is not subject to the firstborn tithe is as it's a minority case, and we don't know what type it is, so it's not offered. If the mother was an offering, the sac is buried as it was fit to be consecrated from birth. We said we can't do superstitious ancient practices with an amniotic sac. It said it should be fine if it's being used for therapeutic reasons, and it gives examples, along with some practices that were done, like painting a tree with red pigment to alert neighbors that somebody was sick, so that way they'll pray on his behalf, which is a good thing to do. And that's the end of chapter 4.